ever get this feeling like Tolkien's world is closer than we think?
Mm.
Like those rings of power, they weren't just some fantasy trinket, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going deeper than elves and wizards, right? We're talking straight up power, ambition,
Yeah.
and how these themes that Tolkien was working with, they're kind of scary relevant now in 2024. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
All the headlines, AI ethics,
Yeah.
political standoffs,
Right.
even just our obsession with the latest tech.
Totally.
It's all got this like rings vibe, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it really does. What's fascinating is that Tolkien, he wasn't writing about AI or, social media.
Right.
He was exploring fundamental human anxieties, those timeless struggles we have with power, with the choices we make.
Yeah.
And yet here we are decades later and we're facing those same questions, just with, fancier gadgets.
Yeah, exactly. And to help us unpack all of this, we're going deep with the insights of the Technomage.
Oh, great stuff.
This is someone who really connects those dots, right?
Yes.
Between Tolkien's world and our modern anxieties in a way that's going to make you see both in a whole new light, I think.
Absolutely. The Technomage's central argument is that each ring, it represents a specific type of desire,
Okay.
a unique vulnerability, you could say, that power latches onto and exploits.
It's true.
And with the new Amazon series, right, shining a light on all those lesser-known rings,
Yes.
it feels incredibly timely to be, really digging into these themes.
Totally. Okay, so let's take a look inside this treasure chest of rings, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
First up, the elven rings. Now, on the surface, they seem, I don't know, kind of idyllic.
Right, yeah, they do.
Preservation, beauty, holding on to the good things in life. But, as the Technomage points out, even the elves, right, even with all their wisdom, their long lifespans, they still get a little, how do I put it, attached.
Attached to things staying the same.
Yes, like a little too attached to things staying the same.
He makes this great point that the elves' desire for preservation, it wasn't inherently wrong.
Right.
But it became a vulnerability. And think about it.
Yeah.
In today's world, are we so different? I mean, we cling to familiar technologies.
Yeah.
We cling to these systems that have always been in place.
Right.
Even when maybe, just maybe, they're holding us back.
It's so true.
Remember what happened with Kodak?
Oh, yeah.
This giant in the photography world, they almost went bankrupt. Because they clung to film, even as digital cameras were like taking over the world.
Wow.
They were so busy trying to preserve their legacy
Right.
that they missed the boat on the future.
Yeah.
That's the Elven Ring, playing out in the real world.
Wow. That hits close to home. You know, it's easy to get like caught up in the individual stories of the rings.
Right.
But the Technomage makes this point about how they're all connected.
Yeah.
He calls it like this invisible thread of power
Right.
that runs through all the races of Middle-earth.
Yes.
Right. It's binding them together in this web of like desire and temptation.
It's like each race represents a different part of, like our own human nature, different ways we can be tempted by power,
Right.
both individually and as a society,
Right. It's Sauron. He's like the puppet master.
Oh, yeah.
He's up there pulling the strings, playing on those desires,
Exactly.
exploiting those vulnerabilities.
Precisely. He gets it, Power, it isn't just about brute force. It's about, manipulation.
Okay.
It's about understanding what makes people tick
Yeah.
and then using it against them. You see it all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Think about Cambridge Analytica.
Okay.
The way they used all that data to target people with political ads during elections.
Wow.
They tapped into people's fears, their biases,
Yeah.
and swayed their opinions without them even realizing it,
It's kind of scary.
It's a perfect example, I think, of how Sauron's tactics are still very much in play.
Right. It's like we talk about how the elves with their, desire for preservation
You're right.
almost fell into the trap, and how the dwarves with their love of all things shiny
Of course.
got played by their own greed.
Right.
But what about men? I mean,
Yeah.
they're the ones who ended up as the Nazgul.
Right. The ring race.
Those terrifying ring wraiths.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was their weakness?
The Technomage says that men, they were particularly susceptible to the rings because of their fear of death
Okay.
and their ambition for, legacy.
I see.
They didn't just want power for themselves.
Right.
They wanted the influence that came with it.
Okay.
Even after, they were gone.
Like that saying, power corrupts. And
Yeah.
absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
Exactly.
They wanted to be legends, but
Yeah.
they just ended up as, cautionary tales.
They were so focused on, defying death,
Wow.
on leaving their mark. Right.
that they became slaves to the very power they thought would set them free.
It's kind of tragic when you think about it that way.
It
makes
right.
me wonder, like, how do we avoid making those same mistakes?
Right.
How can we learn from the downfall of, like, the elves, the dwarves, and men?
Right.
And, navigate these power dynamics in our own world in a way that doesn't, lead to ruin.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I think the Technomage gives us some clues here.
Okay.
He says the first step is awareness.
Okay, so.
Recognizing our own vulnerabilities, the things that we're tempted by,
Yeah.
those whispers of power that promise us everything,
Right.
but for a price.
Right.
So it's about being more like introspective, more critical of like
Yes.
our own desires and motivations.
Absolutely. And not just individually, but like as a society too.
Okay. Yeah.
We need to be aware of the systems in place, the ways we're all being influenced,
Right.
often without even realizing it.
It's like we need to develop a kind of ringdar,
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
a way to spot those whispers of power and resist them.
And that's where Tolkien's work and the Technomage's analysis, it becomes so important. It's
Uh-huh.
not just a fantasy story,
Yeah.
it's like a guidebook
Right.
for understanding how power works in all its forms.
So like if we don't want to end up like Gollum,
Right.
obsessed with some metaphorical precious,
Yeah,
what's the antidote?
right,
The Technomage, he seems to say that knowledge is power.
right.
But it's not just knowing stuff, is it?
No, it's about understanding the nature of power itself, right?
Okay.
The Technomage argues that real power, true power, it doesn't come from domination.
Okay.
It comes from self-awareness.
Yep.
It's about mastering your own desires,
Right.
right? Not trying to control everything and everyone around you.
Right.
It's a lesson, we see it again and again throughout history.
Yeah, it makes you think about someone like Nelson Mandela, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the guy had every reason to be angry, to
Yeah.
want like vengeance and all that after being in prison for 27 years.
Of course.
But instead, what does he choose?
Right.
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness.
Reconciliation.
Yeah.
And he uses his experience to like help heal an entire nation
Powerful.
that was deeply divided by apartheid.
Right. I mean, that's real power.
That's
It's not from some external force. It comes from within.
exactly. And it takes us back to this idea of like developing our own ringdar.
Yes.
Right? Like you were talking about.
Yes.
It's not just about, being aware of forces outside of ourselves trying to manipulate us.
Right.
It's about understanding our own like weaknesses.
Exactly.
The things about ourselves that could lead us down a dark path.
Absolutely.
It's asking ourselves those tough questions.
Yeah, the hard question.
What are my like quote unquote precious desires?
Yes.
What am I willing to give up for them?
Yes. And maybe most importantly, what kind of world am I helping to create? With my choices, with how I act, with how I relate to power in general.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
that's a lot to think about,
Big questions.
especially for, a Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
But seriously though, this has been eye-opening,
It's good stuff.
This whole deep dive, it's
Yeah.
really got me thinking.
Good, good.
So for our listeners, the ones who might be feeling, I don't know, a little overwhelmed right now
Right.
by all this talk of power, temptation,
Yeah.
what would you say is the one thing they should take away from this?
I think the Technomage, he says it best.
Okay.
He says, and I'm paraphrasing here,
Right.
the rings of power, they're not just objects in a fantasy novel.
Right.
They're reflections of our own hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so powerful
Yeah.
because by looking at those temptations, those pitfalls, right?
Yeah.
The things that got the elves, the dwarves, and men, all caught up.
Right.
We actually gain this valuable insight, I think, into our own, like, vulnerabilities.
Right.
And it lets us make more conscious choices in our lives.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, know thyself.
There you go.
Except this time, it's not just about knowing yourself, is it?
No.
It's about understanding how our choices, even the small ones,
Right.
they impact the world around us.
They ripple outwards, It's like we're all part of this huge web of power.
Okay.
And even the smallest acts of courage, of compassion, of just trying to do the right thing,
Yeah,
those things matter.
they do.
They can make a difference.
I like that a lot.
Yeah,
Well, on that note, listeners, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
I agree.
But we're going to leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Ooh, I like it.
If, like the Technomage says, the real test isn't how we use power,
Okay,
but how we resist it.
that's good.
What choices will you make today to resist those seductive whispers of the ring?
Mm.
Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.